Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience. We have a couple of panelists that are having some difficulty logging in, and we're trying to help them navigate. So thanks for your patience. All right, everybody. I think we have many of our panelists here, and I'd like to introduce Secretary Eddie Buffalo from the Department of Public Safety to welcome us here today. Mr. Secretary, we can't hear you.
Okay, what about now? Okay, good, great. Good morning, everyone. Those joining us with WebEx and YouTube, on behalf of Governor Cooper and Co-Chair Anita Earls, we want to welcome you to our bipartisan panel discussion this morning. Thank you for all of those that are joining, and this bipartisan panel will talk about indigent services as well as driver's license restoration. You will hear from 5 great experts across our state who will bring a robust discussion about this topic. And I just want to take a point of personal privilege at this time to thank the governor's office and his staff and team and our committees on TREC, as well as our DPS staff, as well as Senator Mohammed and his staff for bringing forth this discussion this morning. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Senator Mohammed, who will moderate this session today. And thank you all again and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Secretary Buffalo, for your words, and I completely agree with you. I just want to start our day today by thanking the wonderful staff at DPS, the governor's team, the rest of our TREC members, and Conservatives for Criminal Justice Reform, and a whole host of advocates and community leaders who helped make our first bipartisan panel happen today. Of course, I want to thank our panelists. I just want to begin by saying welcome to this insightful and thought-provoking bipartisan panel. First of all, as an attorney that's worked in our criminal justice system for a number of years as a state senator, as a member of our state TREC, Task Force on Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, I, like many of you, have realized that there's so many different facets of criminal justice reform and so many different issues that we're dealing with. And there's so many desperate changes that we need to make. However, there are so many areas of bipartisan support. And 2 of those areas are related to Indigent Defense Counsel services and restoration of driver's licenses for non-driving related suspensions. So we've got a panel of experts here today, and I just want to begin by introducing them quickly. Our first guest on the panel is Keisha Millett. She's a staff attorney at the North Carolina Justice Center Fair Chance Criminal Justice Project. Her work focuses primarily on statewide coalition building and policy advocacy to end criminal justice debt and improve access to housing and employment for individuals directly impacted by the criminal legal system. Then we have Doug Kellogg, is State Projects Director for Americans for Tax Reform. ATR was founded by Grover Norquist in 1986 at the request of President Reagan to advocate for tax reform that saves taxpayer dollars. Doug leads ATR's efforts on criminal justice and free speech policies. Next, we have Aisha McWay, who is a career public defender and indigent defense advocate. She is the executive director of Still She Rises, which provides holistic defense exclusively to mothers. She also is an adjunct professor of law at both Vanderbilt and UVA. Then we have Matt Martins, a former prosecutor, a former law clerk to the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and author of a forthcoming book titled Reforming Criminal Justice, A Christian Proposal. And then we have Jennifer Harjo, who's the Chief Public Defender for New Hanover County's Public Defender's Office and has served in that role since 2008. She represents indigent clients in criminal defense, juvenile cases in the juvenile justice system, and parents and family court. She practices in both district and superior court as well as DWI treatment court. She's a graduate of the University of Tulsa School of Law. So thank you so much for having us and joining us today. So we'll get right to it, and we'll begin by having a discussion, first of all, on indigent defense. As many of you may know, in 1963, the Gideon versus Wainwright ruling essentially provided a fundamental right to counsel for individuals that are indigent in our criminal courts. We're approaching now the 60th anniversary of that. So we're going to have a discussion on that. And I'd like to begin by speaking with Aisha, Matt, and Jennifer about this issue. And feel free to speak whenever you want to chime in, but would like to begin by asking, so 60 years later, how have states realized or failed to realize Gideon's promise? Whoever wants to go first. Jennifer, I think I saw your finger pop. Yep.
I'll give it a try, and that's quite a question. Because there are so many aspects of Gideon and indigent defense, from the smallest of issues in the scheme of things, perhaps not for the person, to traffic tickets and driving while your license is revoked, to capital murder, to parent representation issues regarding children. So I think we've come a long way, at least from the perspective I have in New Hanover County, North Carolina, and soon to be Pender County, North Carolina as well. We have, I believe we've come a long way. Our office is very involved, and our state provides for services for most of those issues where somebody is subject to criminal penalty or loss of driving privilege or loss of parental rights or juvenile issues. There are limitations, and in fact, the statutes, and I'm not going to say for better or worse, it's just what's happened is they have limited some of the representation rights for people that are charged with lower level misdemeanors, such as trespassing or driving while your license is revoked or possession of marijuana. And with the idea that those particular crimes are not crimes for which one is likely to go to jail. And so when people are denied attorneys on those small, misdemeanors, which seem inconsequential, unfortunately, as one may, continue to have some of those ongoing problems, which are largely stemmed from homelessness, poverty, and addiction, they can build up, and they can certainly add up and cause somebody a great deal of problem later on when the underlying issue was not resolved with an attorney. So that's I guess a long way of saying I think we've come a long way. It's good. There's still things that we can do to improve, especially with the circumstances of people not having a driver's license. That's so impactful in their life, and a lot of our criminal justice system prevents people from driving once you get a ticket or once you don't pay a ticket, or under various circumstances.
So you all heard Chief Public Defender Jennifer Harjo talk about how we still might have work to do. I'm happy to hear from Aisha and Matt if they want to chime in on, have we fulfilled Gideon's promise? Are we failing? What more can we do, like Jennifer talked about?
So I will chime in and say that I'm not sure we've realized Gideon's promise. One of the core, lessons out of the Gideon case was the value of representation, the value of having competent counsel. And I think throughout this country, and throughout various jurisdictions, there are cases that we are choosing not to provide counsel based on capacity and funding. There are a number of systems that don't have, formal public defense systems, that case clients are not appointed attorneys or have to jump through hoops to prove that they can't afford to hire an attorney. And ultimately, that I think flies in the face of the lesson that we learned. We ultimately know that after counsel was appointed, Gideon was acquitted, right? He was convicted when he represented himself. He was acquitted once counsel handled his case, and acquitted, pretty quickly. And that is the promise of Gideon. That's ultimately the lesson we learn. And we see throughout this country that jurisdictions continue to fail to do that. So I, would have to say we have yet to realize that promise and truly embed that in our systems. And that starts at how we fund indigent defense in this country and how we prioritize that funding.
Thank
I
you.
mean, the American Bar Association has been doing a state-by-state study and issuing reports on the adequacy of defense counsel. And that's not a reference to the competence. Obviously, the people who dedicate themselves to this are people who care very much about it and are very good at it. But it's an issue of resources. And they've looked at a number of states from Rhode Island, Arizona, Louisiana, Missouri, and issued reports. And they've applied a test that looks at what is the makeup of the caseload in that state, what is the average amount of time it would take to handle a case of that complexity, and then sort of multiplying that out by the number of cases, and then looking at the number of lawyers. And what they found is that it's interesting that state after state, that the results are pretty much the same, which is that each state has about a third of the number of public defenders as is necessary to handle the caseload in that state. And so what you're effectively saying is we're not going to provide enough lawyers to do the work, thus forcing, corner cutting that is undermining the promise of having an adequate defense.
Sure. So both Matt and Aisha, you both talked about different states and different jurisdictions. Can maybe one of you share, since states have flexibility when it comes to administering indigent defense services, is there like a particular model that is seen as particularly innovative or effective within your own research that you've conducted looking at different jurisdictions and states? Something that's working well, and maybe we need to do in North Carolina. Maybe we have places in North Carolina that are working well. Maybe other parts of the state need to do the same.
So I can't point to any state that's doing it perfectly in every jurisdiction in the state, right? So I'm not avoiding the question, but I genuinely don't have an answer to say we should do this. I do think that there are jurisdictions that are better funded and structured more, apply structure more intentionally around the staffing of cases, and I think we'd see that in North Carolina as well. But I think that's the problem. Every state has probably an example of a jurisdiction that is doing it well because they are funding in a different way than some of the other counties or cities in the state. But at a statewide level, one of the challenges of even having a state system, which I do think is probably the model that we want most states to get to, is that each jurisdiction is not created equal. And that means that resources aren't distributed necessarily equitably, and that's a challenge.
Thank you, Aisha. The reason I generally like to ask that, as a legislator, as a lawmaker, I like to look at what other states and other jurisdictions are doing instead of having to reinvent the wheel. So it's always good to hear from the experts about what we could do better. Matt, did you want to say anything about anything that you wanted to
I would just say that, the challenge in answering that is that we don't have a criminal justice system in America. We have, 3,200 and some criminal justice systems in America, with each jurisdiction, whether that's at the county level or at the parish level or at the state level or at the federal level, and even in the federal level, multiple districts with different U.S. attorneys with different priorities. And so you have literally thousands of different criminal justice systems in the United States, and with varying levels of commitment to indigent defense. And there's really a question of political will, right? What legislator wants to run on the platform of providing more criminal defense? I suspect that in most jurisdictions that's not a winning formula, uh, but it's an American formula. I mean, it's in our Bill of Rights. It was one of our founding concepts that if the state's going to take your freedom, if the state's going to use coercive force against you, they're not going to be able to run roughshod over the poor. And I think that that's something we should all believe in America as Americans. But it's a hard sell politically, and that's really one of the challenges.
Thank you, Matt. I'll ask Jennifer this particular question. Since you're running an actual public defender's office, Jennifer, how do we balance protecting the rights of individual citizens with the limited resources that oftentimes maybe your offices struggle with and so many other offices across our state?
Well, and that is a very difficult thing to do. I have lawyers and staff that, are underpaid. And they are working hard, working many hours. It leaves me running to Raleigh or other public defenders as well, trying to advocate on behalf of our offices, where I think that we have to advocate, 3 times as hard, if not more, than, the district attorney's office. And so it's just that is a difficult situation, no doubt. Unfortunately, at least from where my office is located physically and from the political nature of our, local county, and, that we have better resources than others. I'll say that. I'm not saying that we have sufficient. I'm still fighting for resources that we don't have, that we desperately need. But other areas of the state are underfunded and woefully underserved. There are a lot of attorneys in some of the smaller counties that are just not going to work for the few pennies that they get per hour for representing indigent defendants. So it's tough. It is a struggle. It is a struggle.
Just to comment on that, one of the disparities that exists, for example, is that in a lot of states, in a lot of jurisdictions, what public defenders of comparable level and experience are paid is less than their counterparts in the prosecutor's office. I can't conceive of what the justification for that would be. Why the state prosecutor should be paid more with comparable levels of experience. And that's true in my home state right now of Virginia. I suspect it's probably true in North Carolina. And Jennifer also mentioned, even the appointed counsel rates that are paid. I mean, there's been studies and state Supreme Court opinions on this around the country about the rates being so abysmally low that they don't even cover overhead. I think there's been some issues in North Carolina around that, to the point where it doesn't even cover overhead, and so folks won't take on appointed cases. I think there was a case relatively recently in Wisconsin where the rate was so low that the clerk's office had to call several hundred lawyers before they could find somebody who would even take on an appointed case in some jurisdictions, because the rate was something like $40 an hour, which was going to be a money-losing proposition. And you have to wonder what type of representation we're giving someone when it's the 250th lawyer who accepts it, and whether that person is someone, if they're willing to take it on at that rate, whether there's someone who really can provide adequate representation.
No, Matt, I absolutely agree with you. Obviously, lack of financial resources shouldn't limit quality of legal representation for anyone. So you both, Aisha talked a little bit about jurisdictions and lack of resources. Matt, you did too, and other states. Can you tell me, maybe the two of you, talk a little bit about what do the left and the right agree about when it comes to indigent defense services? It sounds like you're talking about lack of resources is something we can all agree on. We need to support. Are there other issues in providing indigent defense counsel that both the right and left agree on that we need to do better or could do?
So I am not sure. I think there's room for agreement around how we are spending money, and who's going through the system, and who we're choosing to, like, how we're choosing to um, I think there's a gap in the way that our criminal legal system, for example, is structured. And I think fiscally conservative folks could see that there's a better way to spend money on some of these issues rather than incarcerating folks for driving on a suspended license, and paying for them to be in custody, or paying for people to be in custody who haven't paid fines and fees. I think we're just sort of creating a cycle of debt. Now, the reasons why we may think that this is, sort of a silly choice may differ, but ultimately, I think that there are changes that we can make to our system that can tackle both the fiscally conservative perspective and the sort of more constitutional provision of counsel, and what is more humane. But I'm not sure that there are, like, fundamental things that we agree on, because I'm not sure that people agree that everyone should have the right to counsel. So I'm not sure what those other, like, fundamental pieces are, but I do think approach wise we can get to some of the same places.
Yeah, when you say that the left and the right agree, I think the people on this call agree, and we might be on the left and the right. I think what the public agrees on is not funding criminal defense. I think they agree on that on the left and the right. Um, I don't think that there's public support for this idea, and I think part of that is a view that a common view that if you got arrested, you're guilty. Why am I defending guilty people? I think that there's a lack of civics education, frankly, to explain to people how our system works, the importance of this, how it's a founding ideal of our country, how it's a part of eliminating the disparity between the rich and the poor, about how it's part of holding the government to account, how we don't believe that the government is infallible. Our founders didn't believe that. We don't believe that. And that the way we establish guilt or innocence is by testing the evidence. I think that there's a lack of civics education around the importance of criminal defense. I mean, what you see, for example, is that anytime there's an exoneration, there's a lot of hand wringing, and I hope that, this person can sue. They can't, mostly, and there's a lot of like regret, at that point, but a failure to recognize that these things happen for reasons that we know. And one of those reasons is a lack of adequate defense at the front end. So if you're committed to avoiding wrongful convictions, you need to be committed to the process that prevents wrongful convictions. I mean, when you go back and read Gideon, it's an amazing opinion. It talks about the fact that your ability to establish your innocence in a system with complicated rules and with a trained advocate on the other side, your opportunity to defend yourself would be meaningless if you did not likewise have someone who understood the rules and who was a trained advocate going against the state's trained advocate. I mean, the state doesn't send civilians, non-lawyers in to represent them. They recognize the importance of having a skilled advocate to represent their interests, and we should likewise be interested in having the same on the defense side for the purpose of ensuring that we're getting accurate results.
Thank you. I appreciate it. As a society, we generally like to, in the court of public opinion, find people guilty immediately, even though we're innocent or we're proven guilty. Just real quick, do you have any thoughts, Matt, about suggestions as far as how public defenders and prosecutors can work together, maybe potentially to reduce recidivism rates, or what maybe prosecutors can do better? I know we've got a couple of prosecutors on here and DAs, that some of our friends that are on here, but as far as any suggestions and thoughts that you have, where since they're both public interest attorneys, but one's representing indigent, the other's representing the state, how can they both work together in creating a much more just justice system?
Yeah, so I'm not a criminologist, so I'm not an expert in that, but I can make one observation, which is that I think that there's a common perception that once you're charged and arrested, you should be detained prior to trial. I think somehow that notion has caught on, which I think is a travesty, honestly. When the Supreme Court in Salerno versus United States ruled that pretrial detention was permissible for the additional reason, not only of flight risk, but of future dangerousness, they viewed that as a very narrow exception. They said, Chief Justice Rehnquist, writing for the majority, said that presumption is or liberty is the presumption. And yet somehow I think we've flipped that notion both in the public's mindset and in the courts to where detention is the presumption. I think that public thinks when someone is charged and arrested, they should be held until trial. That certainly wasn't our founders' view, as reflected in the Eighth Amendment and the right to bail. But it wasn't the Supreme Court's view in Salerno. And yet, on any given day, including today in the United States, roughly 400,000 to 500,000 people are detained prior to trial, 2/3 of them for traffic offenses, property crimes, and drug charges. I can't imagine that we couldn't find conditions of release that would reasonably assure the safety of the community for people charged with those relatively minor offenses. And to your point about public safety, the largest study that's really been done on what happens when we let people out prior to trial with reasonable bail was done in Houston, which was subject to a consent order, Travis County, Texas. The University of Pennsylvania released that study last year, looking at the 3 years before the bail reform and the 3 years after the bail reform that came as a result of a consent order. And what they showed is that recidivism goes down when people were released prior to trial. And part of the reason for that is, of course, if you disrupt someone's life with the pretrial detention on a relatively minor charge, they're going to lose their job, they're going to lose the stability of housing, it's going to disrupt their children's lives, and it's going to create cascading events that will, it appears, cause someone to return to crime more likely. And so in some ways, we're shooting ourselves in the foot by detaining people prior to trial. We're not actually making the communities more safe, at least that study shows, but actually making them less safe.
Thank you, Matt, for that. So one last question is related to indigent defense counsel, and any one of you is more than welcome to speak about the issue, especially looking at the potentially the lack of indigent services, or particularly difficulty of having those type of attorneys and those resources in rural parts of our state. How can we tackle that? Do you have any suggested solutions related to that in rural North Carolina?
Well,
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I think the solution, at least that has been brought to the attention of indigent defense services in North Carolina, is that we need public defender offices. If we don't have private assigned counsel willing to take those cases, or a sufficient number of private assigned counsel in those areas, then they need services from a state government agency, and they need to create public defender offices, which are still going to be difficult to fill if we don't provide sufficient salaries for those positions, because we're still going to have lawyers willing to come into those areas to take employment. So, I think at least one way in which we are trying or attempting to do so is by creating more offices in those rural or smaller counties, but we are going to have to pay the people sufficiently in order to get them there and entice them to come to want to work there. I mean, an especially difficult thing right now after COVID, when everybody wants to work from home.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing this. Does anybody else want to talk about rural indigent defense services before I move on to driver's license restoration? Thank you to all three of you. Really appreciate your time and speaking. So as far as lack of financial resources to pay court fees and fines, obviously should never be a barrier to get to work, to drive to school, to maybe take your elderly family members or your child to a doctor's appointment. But unfortunately, that's often a reality for hundreds and thousands of North Carolinians that don't have a driver's license simply because they're unable to pay their court fees and fines. It's my understanding that since 2017, 24 states, including the District of Columbia, have passed some sort of reforms related to limiting or ending debt-related driving restrictions. However, North Carolina still continues to follow this track. So joining us today for this conversation now is Keisha and Doug. So I wanted to talk to you both about this issue now. So states seem to be coalescing behind ending the debt-based driver's license suspensions. What do you think that has led to this growing willingness to end driver's license suspensions for reasons other than dangerous driving? Feel free, whoever wants to go first.
Sure. Well, great to be with you all today. Thanks very much for having me. So from our perspective at Americans for Tax Reform, I mean, I think what we're seeing with driver's license suspension reform is a lot of common sense coming through. So when people hear about this, they may not know what's going on, but I think it's rather intuitive for legislators and citizens to grasp that if you want somebody to pay a debt, you probably want them to go to work. That's how most of their loans work, right? You get a mortgage, the bank likes to know you have a job and can pay it. So why, when it comes to government and traffic fines, would we make it more difficult for you to go to work to pay the debt? It's just completely nonsensical. It's counterintuitive. So I think on the face of it, we get right in the door on convincing people, whether it's left or right, that this doesn't make sense. So I think that's why we've seen a lot of progress and that it's been very bipartisan, red states, blue states. I think also, and folks are probably well aware, I mean, with the criminal justice system growing, I think with all criminal justice issues, you're dealing more when you're talking to people with folks who have some exposure. So I think the last stat I saw was about 1 in 3 Americans have been arrested. I mean, I'm one of them. We all went to college. It happens. So people either know somebody or they themselves have had interactions. And if you talk about the amount of people who've received traffic tickets or been pulled over for speeding or whatever it is, I mean, the numbers skyrocket. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of people. So again, this is an issue that people get, even if it hasn't happened to them. They understand that the system is there, it's impacting people. The fines are not welcome if they've had to pay a traffic fee. So I think that piece of it helps get in the door and has helped us make progress. And then there's also an awareness that paying sudden expenses is not easy. We all see the surveys where Americans can't handle emergency expenses. So people understand that it's not easy to come up with cash for some people, and when it's unexpected, that can be difficult. And then as we get into it further, it goes completely against the interest of taxpayers and citizens to take these situations which people have a sense that arise relatively frequently and affect a lot of people, and then run the risk of turning that into a cycle of additional crime by taking somebody who really needs to get to work, doesn't have somebody they can rely on, lives in a place like North Carolina, where the vast majority of people are driving to work. There's not a well built out transit network. And then that person gets desperate and drives, and they get pulled over, and then they have an additional misdemeanor offense, criminal offense. They're going to get pulled in a criminal court, and potentially could do jail time, and that's only going to make it more difficult for them to, if they still had their current job, get to that or get a job in the future. I mean, it just creates a complete quagmire and a mess that doesn't work for the individual, and it doesn't work for taxpayers. And I know we'll talk more about the costs of running this system, but I think as you just go down that line, it's just at every step, we can talk to people about why this doesn't make sense, why it's not good for you personally, and why it's not good for the people who are having their licenses revoked. And it's not really doing a lot for government either. So I think that's why we've seen a lot of progress.
Thank you, Doug. So Keisha, Doug's talked about why he thinks we've seen some progress in other states. What are your particular insights or thoughts about why we've been able to see progress on this front in other states?
Absolutely. I think there's just growing attention to the need to expand our understanding of what it means to have safety in our communities. And when it comes to thinking about driver's license restoration and the importance of people being able to have access to their driver's license, particularly when it's not correlated with someone's actual dangerousness on the road, that also is a way that we can help improve our community safety. So as Doug provided the example of the driver who might have the driver's license suspension, may live in a rural county, be in a really tough spot, and just make that tough decision to drive and end up with the potential of having another ticket or other issue, another challenge that we see is that when someone is in that position where they were not able to pay their ticket and have that indefinite driver's license suspension, they also don't have insurance on their car. And so that means that we have uninsured drivers that are driving in our state to try to contribute to the economy, try and support their families. And that actually creates more of a public safety risk. And so when you have states like North Carolina where there are indefinite suspensions, then that means that we are looking at many of our neighbors, friends, and community members who may have suspensions for 8 years. They may have suspensions for a lifetime, and they have had to figure out a way to maneuver their way around the way that the system works. I think also kind of just with the wave that we've had, particularly over the last decade, of people being more curious and committed to criminal justice reform, there's a recognition too that we are seeing here. This is another example of that two-tiered system of justice. And so we see that there are individuals who may get traffic tickets, they may get some type of infraction, and they go into court and they're able to pay for those court costs. They're able to pay whatever additional fines, get the representation that we need. And then we see many of our community members, those who are incredibly under-resourced. They're not able to, in many cases, have access to representation for a traffic court. And so they're going in on their own. They may not, as Doug mentioned, have even the $400 or $100 saved aside to cover the cost of a ticket, and then they get stuck. And so we're not seeing a lack of accountability for individuals who are choosing not to be responsible for whatever traffic infraction there may be, but we're seeing that some people are able to maneuver through and others are not. And as more broadly, people are interested in thinking about how do we understand justice in 2023? How do we understand safety in this new day? I think that's one of the considerations that people are pondering.
Keisha, real quick, just to follow up with you, can you share with our audience, do you know approximately how many North Carolinians don't have a driver's license simply related to failure to fines and fees, approximately?
Yes, so we have about 300,000 people who have debt-based driver's license suspensions. And then when you add include the people who that have the amount of who were not able to pay, that is approximately 1.2 million North Carolinians. And so that also accounting for that, we have disproportionate impacts on Black residents in North Carolina, which again, kind of when you think about sort of what is the kind of upstream, what does that look like? We're also seeing in North Carolina's population, about 31% of North Carolina traffic stops are for Black residents, and 4 times higher than that of white residents.
Thank you, Keisha, for sharing that. Just so to provide some background, here at the North Carolina General Assembly, we have had tried efforts and filed bills related to tackling issues of fines and fees previously, and the bills have had bipartisan support. But there are still opponents of this issue of ending the debt-based driver's license suspensions, and they point to usually the importance of creating accountability for failures to appear and failures to pay. It's my understanding, when I've looked previously at AOC data, that more than not, often than not, when people have court fees and fines, that money is not already coming into the state coffers after a certain amount of time. So can you tell me, either one of you, based on your thoughts, is this argument about some sort of accountability or making sure people are paying these fines and fees or appearing, does it really hold any weight for enforcing people to continue to go and drive without a driver's license, hoping that eventually one day that they'll pay these fines and fees?
Sure. Keisha, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you. So I would say, as a short answer, no, does not really hold weight there. And kind of as you were alluding, this idea that we'll have an indefinite driver's license suspension and one day someone will determine that they have to make sure that they come up with the money in some way. What we're actually seeing, and what we believe with the North Carolina Justice Center is that this indefinite suspension in particular is actually working against us and working against the people who are dealing with these traffic tickets. And so if you think about the ways that people are able to contribute to the economy, the ways that they're able to build a saving and support their families, that's by getting to work. With a mostly rural state, or a state where many people have to access employment that is not in walking or biking distance, then that means that we are inhibiting individuals' abilities to access the employment that they need to have the income to be able to cover these costs. And so when we think about that, that creates a challenge. I would also like to just point to there's the idea that maybe we limit the suspension and we have 1 year that people have to come up with, because there is data that supports that within 1 year time period, people are able to people are more likely to pay the cost and more likely to be able to pay the cost than the indefinite suspension. However, that means that we're still positioning certain people at a disadvantage. And so again, the individuals who have more money are able to either get out of a ticket and be represented and get out of a ticket, or are able to pay those ticket costs outright. They don't have to deal with this blink twice, look at it ever again. And again, we're thinking about our residents in our state who are most under-resourced and in the most vulnerable position, who are having to continue to deal with this. And so that 1 year suspension, and by that way, is actually just not fair.
Thank you, Keisha. Go ahead, Doug.
Those are, yeah, great points, and I think that gets to the big one. I mean, the first issue, I think, we're talking about a policy is an inordinate impact on some people and as zero impact on other people. I mean, how many people can easily pay the fine fee don't pay? I mean, if those people maybe need some additional accountability we can work on, but somebody who cannot pay, or the person who can pay, I mean, we're immediately in a different circumstance. And as we talked about the sort of collateral consequences, we'll talk more about that. That's you know, those follow somebody around, and they're creating far more accountability than was designed with this punishment. The other piece of it is, you know, I think it's an interesting question, because we're kind of imposing the penalty, and now we're beyond the point of worrying about accountability. We should be focusing more on, does this work? And does it work for the government side of this? You know, I think we've all seen the stats from the Brennan Center study on how counties have struggled. They're spending, you know, close to half of every dollar they're collecting to enforce fines and fees. And we got the police chasing everybody around to be tax collectors and enforce this regime to produce not a lot of cash. I mean, this is a situation we see. I mean, this is really the junction of tax policy and criminal justice policy. I mean, it's reminiscent of just bad taxes and funding sources that don't work. So it reminds me of the meme, you know, congratulations, you played yourself. I mean, the government is running a system that just doesn't work well. It's not serving the government well. So I think the accountability question is on the punishment side. We're talking about, does the system work for either party? And so on the, you know, the court side, it's not proving effective. So the accountability thing seems almost beside the point once we're getting into what are the impacts of this, what is the system doing, how can we improve it? And when the answer is it's not really working for anybody, you know, the accountability piece just, you know, seems like a side point.
Appreciate that, Doug and Keisha. Moving on, as far as enforcing driver's license suspensions and driving without a license, it obviously consumes significant amount of law enforcement and court resources. I mean, I myself have seen where police officers have had to show up to court. They're being subpoenaed to deal with driving while license revoked for whatever reason, and it could be related to fines and fees. We've seen probation officers file potential probation violations because now you've picked up a new driving while license revoked, and it could have been related to your fines and fees. So can you talk a little bit about, do you really think that this is a valid investment in public safety? Go ahead, Keisha.
I'll actually turn it over to Doug first. Thank you.
I feel like I was getting into that a little bit. I mean, I think the answer is no. But the broader problem, especially from our perspective, I think for folks on the right, is that we're twisting what law enforcement is supposed to do. So we're twisting the incentives and turning, the guys with guns who are supposed to be focused on public safety and protecting the public and making them tax collectors. So we're taking, a core function of government, which conservatives believe in. We love the police. We want to make sure that there's law and order. And then we're taking their time, and then also we're not just taking their time and resources, we're making them focused on making money and extracting money from the public. And that's just naturally, we understand as people who believe in free market economics, people react to incentives. And famously, this is an issue in Ferguson. I won't go into the details there, but it's a significant portion of a local budget comes from fines and fees. The courts need to justify the driver's license suspension, so they want the cops out there making this work as best as they can. And that just should be very concerning. So not just from the return on investment problem, which we mentioned before, but from this is not how this important core piece of government is supposed to work. So I think that is a big concern there, in addition to just the wasted time. And I think there's certainly, some practical improvements that can be made. But I think the principle there is first, and why we want to repeal the practice, significantly reform the practice. I mean, that's the biggest reason. But also we can do things to make it function better, make it easier for people to show up and pay their fines, things like the text messaging, making court a little more modernized, those kinds of improvements. But ultimately it's that flaw in the system that should warrant conservatives getting involved and looking for big reform.
And I would just add as a note that we are also seeing huge vacancies with different law enforcement offices across the state. And so with that, then to ask that the resources being used for these traffic related, not as much of a public safety risk means, and which ultimately is not helping public safety, then that also creates further strain. And so it's something that should really be reexamined.
Thank you both. So what I'm hearing is, again, our goal should be putting people safely back on the road. Obviously, we want them insured. We want them to be able to drive to work, go to the grocery store, run their errands, take their children to school, maybe go get an education themselves, and of course, drive without dignity and fear. And I heard you heard me talk to you earlier about how we've tried to tackle this issue in a bipartisan way before. But what's keeping North Carolina from still passing this significant reform? Keisha, you talked about 300,000 folks. I've seen some research numbers out there that we might potentially have up to 1 million people out there in North Carolina who don't have a driver's license simply related to this issue. So what's stopping us? One other thing that I'll bring up is as someone that has pushed this legislation, one of the barriers we've come against is some of the administrative aspects of implementing this. So can either one of you speak to the issue about what's keeping us from making this reform, and maybe potentially what can we do to make it a reality for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians?
Yes, thank you for that. And you mentioned the 24 states, and I believe the 24th state just passed their reform last month. And so, we are right in line to be on the path towards moving this forward. And something that I think does cause this delay is that there are misconceptions that continue to exist and that are perpetuated around driver's license suspensions. There's still much belief that that people are able to pay the debt, but they're just actively choosing not to pay the debt. However, we do have in North Carolina an ability to pay rule, and also forms that can be used to actually clarify who is able to pay and not able to pay. And so there is a process that can be in place. And I know that there also, I wouldn't have as much insight as other folks do who work directly in the public defender's offices or the district attorney's offices, but there are many who also have their own processes for determining ability to pay as well, even beyond using the new AOC CR 415 form. And so when we think about that, there's a way that we can start to lead with that and look at ability to pay first rather than make assumptions or guesses. And so that is something that I think is causing a delay and perhaps some confusion.
Thank you, Keisha. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to continue to make our case. I mean, certainly, I think Keisha's getting into this a little bit. I mean, the states have issues with how the system works. There's pushback from the courts on legislators when these proposals come up. But a lot of those are workable problems. I mean, some of the more challenging criminal justice topics that pop up, the pushback is a little bit harder and can be more difficult to deal with politically. I mean, I think the lift here, there may be some things to work through, but it's certainly manageable. But we need to be out there doing our part to help the case. Like I said, I think we have a great case. I think it gets through to people, but they have other, voters have other things they're paying attention to. But the workforce issue is a huge part of this. We need to remind them that this plays into that. And we've workforce shortage stories all over the place. The stat I had for North Carolina was that there's 160,000 open positions that can't be filled, even if every unemployed worker were employed for the state. So those kinds of stats, the truck driver shortages, those are things that should play to everybody. And we need to address those challenges just generally, so we can get people's attention by just continuing to make sure that we're making the case that's appropriate for the time, so they can see the benefit of it. But yeah, I think that, the challenges that exist can be surmounted, and we can continue to focus on making the best arguments and being there to support the process. But I think it's eminently doable. It's certainly necessary. And as Keisha mentioned, the other states leading the way, there's, whoever you're talking to, there is a state with one party in governing and split majorities, and every situation you can think of that's passed reform on driver's license suspension. So nobody has to be scared that they're jumping off a cliff that somebody hasn't jumped off before, and it's all going to work out politically.
And as Doug alluded to, but many of these states have already gone over these same considerations, and so they're thinking about what might it look like to make sure that people are able to pay if they are able to pay, or show up to court if they which is the ultimate goal. And so, as Doug mentioned, having those text reminders in place, which is one of the main reasons that people don't come to court, is because they forgot. And so having text reminders in place so that people are showing up to court, making sure that there are questions about ability to pay, and kind of just working with the existing forms that are available for that. And then already, just, I guess, broadly recognizing that, as Doug mentioned, that there are many states that have led the way for us. And so we have a lot of examples that we can draw from.
Thank you so much, Keisha from the Justice Center, and Doug from Americans for Tax Reform. I'm looking forward to hopefully having you both here at the General Assembly and helping us make those arguments in a bipartisan fashion to make this a reality for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians that don't have a driver's license. So, Caroline, I think we're out of time. We don't have time for questions right now, but I do want to thank everybody for joining us, all the panelists for the discussion. Like we talked about, I think it's critical to have quality indigent defense services for everyone in North Carolina, regardless of their financial situation and the barriers that they're dealing with. And obviously, we've got to do something related to fines and fees, related to driver's license restorations for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians who can't get to work, who can't go to the grocery store, and are dealing with so many everyday obstacles that so many North Carolinians like myself and maybe some of you take for granted when we get in our car and we have a driver's license and we don't have those barriers. So I would urge you all to continue to stay engaged, stay informed. Again, I want to thank DPS. I want to thank the governor's staff and the rest of my TREC colleagues for joining us today, and for everyone else who's participated. and listen to our conversation today. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.